Pastor Lewis, and he's going to be speaking to us now on the subject, Angels' Part in Protecting and Directing the Preaching Work. I'd like to reintroduce Brother Frank Lewis.
It seems that she just couldn't get herself together. She was a full-time minister of Jehovah's Witnesses, had been for many years, but this morning it was just one of those days, apparently. She usually met midweek with the group at the Kingdom Hall, but Murphy's Law, anything that's going to go wrong is going to go wrong, and sure enough, it did. She was watching the clock. Time came to be with the group, and the group went without her. She just wasn't sick, but she didn't feel well. But about that time, the telephone rang. She picked up the phone, and immediately she became alert. It was the voice of a very distraught woman. She listened carefully. The woman in the discussion indicated very firmly that she was about to take her life. The sister, now having complete command, got the woman's name, address, told her to stay right where you are, by your telephone. I'll be right there. Quickly, she grabbed her book bag with Bible in it and went down to that person's house. This was in the Netherlands, in the city of Rotterdam. When she got there, she went into the house, and sitting right next to the phone, and near her, the implements of suicide, was the woman. The pioneer sister began to talk to the woman, found out that the woman was a very reasonable person, but could see no way out of this system of things. There was no way to diffuse her anxiety and her depression. But she wanted to talk to someone so that when she took her life, they wouldn't say, well, there goes another nut. So she opened this big, thick telephone book, put her finger down, saw the number, and dialed it. That woman is now very much alive and one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, who messed up the beginning of that sister's day? Who directed that finger to that particular number? Well, it's obvious, isn't it, that Jehovah God is using angels in directing and in protecting his preaching work. And we don't see angels. We don't have the physiology to see an angel. They're not human. We can't see the wing, but we know it's there because of its activity. But we know through our study of the Bible, through the activity within our lives and the lives of other of Jehovah's Witnesses, that angels are very powerful. They travel at tremendous speeds. In fact, Daniel, while praying, the prayer went from Daniel to Jehovah, who is somewhere beyond the quasars. Jehovah heard the prayer, dispatched an angel, and the angel was there next to Daniel, ready to answer the prayer before Daniel finished praying. It's in Daniel Chapter 9, verses 20 to 23. These angels serve as agents and deputies of Jehovah. They act as responsible executioners of the divine purpose. In fact, remember in our Bible reading recently about Sodom and Gomorrah, how two angels completely leveled those two cities on behalf of Lot and his two daughters? And how about that one angel that destroyed 185,000, picked the Syrian troops, as mentioned there in 2 Kings 19, verse 35. Angels are real. Jehovah created them. They're there. In fact, the word angel means messenger. And it was the angel Gabriel that appeared to Mary to announce information regarding the birth of the Messiah, Jesus' birth, 1900 years ago. So angels are being used extensively. And angels have great interest in the human family. Notice the interest Paul showed there in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. If you want to keep your Bible handy, we'll be reading some scriptures together now. Now notice the interest, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, and we'll read verse 9 together. For it seems to me that God has put us, the apostles, last on exhibition as men appointed to death, because we have become a theatrical spectacle to the world, to men and to angels. Now why does Paul say that? Why does he use this illustration? Because during the games there in Corinth, what they would do is they would save the most gory, the most blood-curdling act, as it were, to the end, to last. And then when the people had their fill of the games and the gladiators, then they would bring in, many times, the Christians to watch them torn apart. So Paul here uses a very apt illustration that at the end, the last act, as it were, to the Christians involved, and Paul is saying that Christians are involved and that the angels have a direct assignment from Jehovah to look after those in the arena on the world, as it were. But now let's look at the record. We know they're interested in us, the Bible says so. But if you turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 6, and here we have the account of Elijah and his attendant, something we're all familiar with, but it's good to read it together. Now here we find that every time the Syrians would try to do something against Israel, Israel would already know about it. And that became very frustrating to the king. So beginning with verse 11, read along with me, please. Consequently, the heart of the king of Assyria became enraged over this matter, so that he called his servants and said to them, Will you not tell me who from those who belong to us is for the king of Israel? Then one of his servants said, None, my lord, the king, but it is Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, that tells the king of Israel the things that you speak in the bedroom. So he said to the man, You men, go there and see where he is, that I might send and take him. And later the report was made to him, saying, There he is in Dothan. Now notice, he was a little old prophet and his attendant. And what did the king do? Immediately he sent horses and war chariots and heavy military force there. And using good military strategy, decided to come by night and close in upon the city. Dangerous men, these two individuals. When the minister of the true God rose early to get up and went out, why there a military force was surrounding the city with horses and war chariots. At once his attendant said to him, and notice the fleshly thinking, Alas, my master, what shall we do? But he said, Do not be afraid, for there are more who are with us than those who are with them. And Elisha began to pray and say, O Jehovah, open his eyes, please, that he may see. Immediately, Jehovah opened the attendant's eyes so that he saw. And look, the mountainous regions was full of horses and war chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now, to get the complete picture, there was Dothan, and the small basin-like plain between the hills of Samaria and the Carmel range. The Syrians now had completely encircled the city with their mighty war chariots, posted themselves there at night, so that when Elisha would come out, they would descend on him with their good military strategy. But they didn't look behind them. And when Jehovah opened up the eyes of Elisha's attendant, there they were, a mighty army of angels like chariots of fire. And the account goes on to show that the angels merely took care of it nicely. They didn't destroy anyone, just blinded them nicely so that these two little persons led that whole army right out of Dothan. Angelic protection. So the angels do have a part in protecting the preaching work. But what about the past record of directing? Well, let's look at the famous chapter, Acts chapter 8, about the Ethiopians going back to Jerusalem. And they went declaring the good news to many villages of the Samaritans. So there Philip had finished his special pioneer assignment, was going to another one. However, Jehovah's angel spoke to Philip saying, "Rise and go to the south, to the road that runs down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert road." With that he rose and went. And look, an Ethiopian eunuch, a man in power under Queen Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was over all her treasure. So here's the secretary of the treasury now that Philip is being sent to. He had gone to Jerusalem to worship. He was a God-fearing man. But he was returning and was sitting in his chariot and reading aloud the Bible, the prophet Isaiah. And so the Spirit said to Philip, "Approach and join yourself to this chariot." Philip ran alongside and heard him reading aloud the prophet Isaiah, or Isaiah the prophet, and he said, "Do you actually know what you were reading?" What a way to start a Bible study, eh? You know what you're reading? But notice the humility of the man. Really, how could I ever do so unless someone guided me? I notice his good heart. And he entreated Philip to get up and sit down with him. Then after they read the passage, the message got through to him. And you remember what happened? He said, "Here's a body of water. What would forbid me from getting baptized?" Now notice the thing here. This wasn't a emotional holy roller arrangement. This wasn't come down to the front, listen to an enthusiastic preacher, stand up, get saved, and let's fill the bathtub. No, it wasn't that at all. If you'll notice from the account, a very intelligent man had been reading the Bible, seeking understanding. He had gone to Jerusalem to worship. And then when the angel did the directing and Jehovah opened that man's heart, why, he had the Bible, just like that Belgian man you heard about this morning who read the Bible many times, but he didn't get the sense of it until the Ethiopian eunuch was brought together with Jehovah's organization. And what happened? Put the two together, Jehovah's Spirit is at work, and the man willingly and wantingly submitted himself to water immersion. So there's an excellent case in point, I think, of directing the preaching work by recognizing the good heart of that person. And the angel was the one who directed Philip. But now, here we are in the last days of this wicked system. The last book of the Bible, Revelation, shows that we're living at a time when there'll be increased demon activity upon the earth. And we can see that with the irresistible movement of militarized nations, the A-bomb, where scientists are saying that the politicians are no longer using common sense, constantly piling up this sort of thing. The film The Day After gives a little tip of the iceberg as to what would happen when these men would go ahead and use such a weapon. And we can see why men's hearts would be failing them for fear. But Bible students, Jehovah's Witnesses, we're not surprised at that. Revelation 12:12 takes away the surprise because it gives us the answer. And right here, Revelation 12:12, when Jehovah God started to have his son do something there, when he said, "On this account, be glad, you heavens, and you who reside in them." Well, why? Because Christ Jesus now had begun to rule. But woe for the earth and for the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great anger, knowing that he has a short period of time. So there was the Lamb beginning to rule as king in 1914, and what did he do? He cast the devil and his demons out of heaven down to the vicinity of the earth. What do we see? Increased demonic activity. Now, does that mean that God's people are at the mercy of all these demons? Let's look at what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 25. And if you remember now, Matthew 25 is an extension of Matthew 24. where it spoke of the end of the system of things. Well, now, notice verses 31 and 32. When the Son of Man arrives in his glory, and his Father's establishment as the King of his kingdom, and all his holy angels with him, he will sit down on his glorious throne as King. And what will happen? And all the nations will be gathered together before him, and he will separate people one from another, just like a shepherd separates his sheep from the goats. Now, what's happening here? True, there's increased demonic activity, but now Christ Jesus, the King, not the babe, is sitting on his holy throne. He's come with all his holy angels with him, those same angels that are very concerned about God's people on the earth. So we know the angels are there. They're with the mighty Christ Jesus. But question, what then is the angel's present assignment? Let's look for the answer in the last book of the Bible, Revelation. Revelation chapter 14, and we'll read it together beginning with verse 6, and notice the assignment. And I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, and he had everlasting good news to declare as glad tidings to those who dwell on the earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people, saying in a loud voice, Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of judgment by him has arrived. And so worship the one who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and fountains of water. And the angel here is a very definite assignment, doesn't he? In spite of the increased demonic activity. But this angel, we might say, we know he has an assignment, but he's flying in mid-heaven. The demons will be cast out of heaven down to the vicinity of the earth. A demon can get to me pretty quick if that angel isn't alert up there in mid-heaven. But question, where is mid-heaven? Again, let's go to the Bible. Turn just a few pages to chapter 19 and look at what verse 17 says. I saw also an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice and said to all the birds that fly in mid-heaven, Come here, be gathered together to the great evening meal of God. The birds flying in mid-heaven. Can you see birds? Of course we can. We can see birds. We can see birds that are quite distantly up there in the heavens. But he's in mid-heaven. He's in the vicinity of the earth. So this angel then would be where the birds fly. And very conscious of Jehovah's people. So these angels then that had announced the birth of Christ 19 years ago, 100 years ago, and had been in subjection to Christ ever since, have now, from 1914 onward, been announcing the birth of the kingdom. But now, Christ as the King. But now notice, these angels would love to peer into these things and to do some of the work that has been given to Jehovah's people. They have special assignments, yes. They have oversight of the preaching of the good news of the kingdom. But to whom is the privilege given, the command given at Matthew 24:14? And this good news of the kingdom will be preached in all the inhabited earth people, remember? For a witness to all the nations, and then the accomplished end would come. So it's Jehovah's Witnesses then that have that privilege of preaching and teaching the good news of the kingdom. The angels don't announce it. Humans announce it. Yes, although there is increased demonic activity, there is also increased angelic activity. There they're performing an unseen, protecting and directing the preaching work. That's right, we don't see them, but we don't see the demons either. But we see what's happening on the earth. These angels cooperate with and even supervise the work, helping, guiding, directing all of us in the field service. And did you remember in Revelation 14 it says the angel is flying as in post-haste, as in riding speeding mares on royal service, and royal service was not to be interrupted by anyone. sent out by the king. And remember, he spoke in a loud voice. Why a loud voice? He wants to be heard. That's his assignment from Jehovah to the King Christ Jesus. So the angel is under orders to protect and direct, just like we are under orders to preach and to teach. So the angels, working together with Jehovah's visible organization, like the angel with Philip, and bringing Philip together with that fine Ethiopian man. So in the time of the end in which we live, the increased angelic activity is felt by Jehovah's people as they carry out their commission. Let's look at some modern-day examples. If you ever look at a map of Asia and see all those millions of people there, and you wonder, just how is Jehovah going to get the message to all these people? Well, Jehovah knows their heart. Angels can be used as messengers to sort them out. Now, one good case in point was in the country of Thailand, where there is one publisher to every 63,520 people. Now, how would the work be taken care of there? Well, a family in a remote area of Laos had received some magazines, the Watchtowers, in their language. And with that political upheaval in Laos a few years ago, if you recall, they fled south going through Thailand. And as they were fleeing, they stopped and were given some sort of asylum, or hospitality was extended to by a family there in Thailand. Well, then the family left, but when they left the magazines behind. So the man of the house began to read the magazines. And as he read them, he was impressed with the truth of what he has been reading. So what he did was he shared it with his wife, who became very impressed, and his family. And as good people, they shared it with the brother-in-law. Brother-in-law didn't want to hear it, despised it, said that he should stop teaching these things to his sister. In fact, he became so chagrined that his brother-in-law and his sister that he hired a gangster, a hitman, to kill his brother-in-law, this goodwill man that had received the magazines. It was decided between them that what they would do was they would go to the county fair. And then when there would be a group of people around, he said he would get a hand grenade and then pull the pin and toss it so that it would explode right in the vicinity of the brother-in-law, this goodwill man. The day for the fair arrived. The brother-in-law, the goodwill man, and his family went to the fair. And so the brother-in-law wanted to make sure everything would go just right. Went and got hold of the gangster, and they were walking together. And he said, now, you know my brother-in-law is going to be there. Uh-huh. Well, how are you going to do this? He says, I got my hand grenade right here in my pocket. And what I'm going to do, and with that, he hit the hand grenade, he patted his pocket, and the thing went off. Killed the gangster, and severely crippled the brother-in-law. The man of goodwill, being a very nice man, when he heard what had happened, tried to help his brother-in-law, see to it that he got to a hospital and so on. But the brother-in-law became even more hateful, saying that this was just another example of what this man, his brother-in-law, is so wrong, and he influenced the entire village against him. Well, it so happened that this goodwill person who read the magazines saw the name of the branch there in Thailand, which was way south, and wrote to them. So they wrote to the circuit overseer closest to where he was living, which was way down in the Midlands compared to where he was. But that circuit overseer, instead of just making his circuit there, made that great big loop, found this man, encouraged him, stayed with him, gave him additional literature. And then when they found out how bad things were, the circuit overseer recommended he leave where he was and join a congregation rather than being isolated. He joined a congregation where there were 2 pioneers. The entire family studied, needless to say, they progressed wonderfully in the truth. And we don't like to say that the angels killed that man, but we can see the angels protecting the family while the other one went his own way. And who knows, perhaps the demons themselves were just satisfying their own desire for violence. But notice the fine admonition given regarding something of that nature in Isaiah chapter 54. And here in verse 17, such fine, comforting information. It says, any weapon, whatever that may be formed against you, will have no success. And any tongue at all that will rise up against you in this judgment, you will condemn. Now notice the next sentence. This is the hereditary possession of the servants of Jehovah, and their righteousness is from me, is the utterance of Jehovah. So here Jehovah makes it plain that any of those weapons formed against us will not prosper, because it's our inherent right to have the protection that God has promised to those who are dedicated to Him. Well, are we to conclude from this then that angels are powerful, sort of abstract, out there in the gossamer somewhere? Well, not really, because the Bible shows us that angels are individuals. They have a definite personality. They're even identified by names. And there was places in the Bible where angels refused to give their name lest someone bow down and worship them. How unlike Satan, who wanted every human's worship. Those righteous angels didn't want that. That's why they wouldn't give their name even on occasion. But the angels communicate. They have languages. They have spoken the languages of men. They're free moral agents, and they have a sense of humor. That's right. If you want to tickle your funny bone, why, turn with me to 1 Kings. It's chapter 22, and we can see how the angels have a sense of humor, but they're just reflecting their Father Jehovah. 1 Kings chapter 22, and we see this is regarding King Ahab, beginning with verse 19. Here we read, let's look at verse 18. 1 Kings. Anyway, 1 Kings chapter 22. So beginning with verse 19 again. And this he went on to say, therefore hear the word of Jehovah. I certainly see Jehovah sitting upon his throne, and all the army of the heavens standing by him to his right and to his left. And Jehovah proceeded to say, now notice who said this, Jehovah, who will fool Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And this one began to say something like this. Well, that one was saying something like that. Finally his spirit came out and stood before Jehovah and said, I myself shall fool him. At that Jehovah said to him, by what means? To this he said, I shall go forth, and I shall certainly become a deceptive spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. So he said, you will fool him, and what is more, you'll come off a winner. So here Jehovah showed that not only do angels have a sense of humor, but he does too. Who fooled you, Ahab? Now he didn't have to go through this with the angels, but here he is saying, now who's going to fool him? This one said something that way. What do you think? And the other one came out with something that tickled Jehovah. All right, go ahead and try it. And they did. Now, in the Netherlands, there was an Italian family that had recently moved to the city of Rotterdam, and not knowing the Dutch languages yet, they had difficulty communicating. And how they wished and prayed that they could find some Italian families with whom they could share the truth. But they just didn't have the opportunity, and they couldn't do so. But it wasn't long before the Italian Catholic priest had heard that this Italian family is here, and he showed up. And with him, he had his papers with him, and all buongiorno, etc., glad to have you. No doubt he thought this was part of my flock, Italian Catholic, what else? And how disappointed he was when the father said, no, we're Jehovah's Witnesses. And then when the father proceeded to say something about the truth, the priest got irate, angry, used a few cuss words, slammed his papers on the table, and left. Well, the family was a little nervous over that, kind of shook up. But then when he went over to see what the papers were so he could send them back to the priest, there was the names and addresses of 80 Italian families living in Rotterdam. The brother quickly went to work with his new territory, and that was the start of the Italian congregation in Rotterdam. Can't you see the angels having a good belly laugh over that one, though? In India, we often think of those millions of people. And Brother Skinner, who's been over there about 55 years as branch overseer, was talking to the farm family when he came to visit, and explaining how there are 710 million people there in India. And he pointed out how quite often when he has to fly from the branch office to serve a circuit assembly somewhere, and he looks down and he sees those millions and millions of people and no witnesses. But interesting, he says, out of the blue, a man will show up at the branch office and say he wants to know more about the Bible. So Brother Skinner says, when that happens, right away you say, where'd you get our address? And this one man said, well, I got this little piece of paper. Well, his relative had traveled to one of the cities where there's a congregation, had been given the handbill, didn't pay much attention to it, and stuck it in his suitcase. Went all the way back to his village, and when his relative began helping him unpack the suitcase, there was this little message. The man picked it up, read it, was most impressed, wanted to know more, saw the address, and didn't write in, but traveled in to come in to learn more about Jehovah and to have a Bible study started with him. So apparently, when you think of it, the angel flying in mid-heaven could look down at those 710 million Indians and see from his vantage point what Brother Skinner couldn't see from his vantage point of through the window pane of an airplane. So the angel is certainly busy. Brother Skinner told us about a man who got on a train there in India, and he noticed that his sister had packed a book in his suitcase, so he took it out and started to read it. Just took it and wasn't a bit interested. He gave it to the man sleeping next to him. The man next to him looked at the book and figured he's got a long journey, he may as well read. Started to read the book, got so engrossed, passed his destination, kept right on reading, was convinced of the truth, wrote for literature, and now he's pioneering in India. In wonderful ways, Jehovah is gathering the sheep and certainly using his angels. Of course, the work is free in India, as opposed to, say, East Germany, where things are very difficult. And here, two brothers who were going out in service, they thought what we'll do is they'll work some rural territory, and in working it, they thought that to get done quickly so that not to be around in case someone calls the authorities, they would work from opposite ends and then meet in the middle and go. So they started to do that. They started working from opposite ends, and for some reason, they both skipped the houses here and here and met at the one in the middle. They just found themselves there, and they thought, well, while we're here, we'll just work it together. So a woman answered the door, showed unusual interest in the Bible's message, and explained to them that they must have been an answer to her prayer, because she says that morning she was looking at her life and evaluating things in the world, got utterly depressed and in despair. She was praying to Jehovah that morning that if there was any help to be gotten, could she have it? And those two brothers showed up at her door, as she felt, in direct answer to her prayer. Well, the brothers were thrilled at that, but they didn't have time to finish the other two houses, so they had to leave. So what they did do, though, is turn it over to a local publisher. And then when they got talking to the local publisher had made a return visit on this woman, and the woman, now very interested in the truth, said that what she couldn't understand was how it was that these two men could have been working opposite like that and come to her house, because on either side of her are security officers, and both of them would have been picked up, arrested, and jailed almost immediately. They missed those houses and converged at her house in answer to her prayer. Of course, the woman, needless to say, is studying the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses. These sort of parallel thinking that we have and we read about often in the Bible, the example of Cornelius is what I have in mind at this moment in Acts chapter 10. Speaking of Cornelius as a very devout man one fearing God, one together with his whole household made gifts of mercy to people and made supplication to God continually. So like that woman, here was Cornelius and his household praying to Jehovah. And here he is, a military man, a captain. And just about the 9th hour of the day, he saw plainly in a vision an angel of God come in to him and say to him, Cornelius. The man gazed at him and became frightened and said, What is it, Lord? He said to him, Your prayers and gifts of mercy have ascended as a remembrance before Jehovah. So now, send men to Joppa and send a certain Simon who is surnamed Peter. This man is being entrained by a certain Simon the tanner who has a house by the sea. And as soon as the angel that spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his household servants and a devout soldier from among those who were in constant attendance upon him. And he related everything to them and dispatched them to Joppa. Well, you know what happened from there. Peter was told, while the soldiers were traveling to meet him, that when he had that vision of the tablecloth coming down with the unclean things on it, he said, I can't eat that, Lord, it's unclean. And Jehovah told him, never mind that now. What I declare clean, don't you declare unclean. There's some men coming to you. They're going to fetch you, and they're going to take you to this Gentile, this military captain. Go to him and witness to him. He did. The angels directed Peter right there to Cornelius, who had been praying, who had been doing good things. And in answer to that prayer, why, we know how Cornelius was able to get the truth. Isn't it marvelous when you stop and think how here, these people in isolation, as it were, in every form of life, have been able to, by Jehovah's undeserved kindness, pray to God in all sincerity now. And those who have been reading the Bible and want to understand it, Jehovah, they will dispatch that angel and direct the preaching work. But remember now, it's not the angel who does the witness work. The angels have peered into these things, stooped down, as it were, try to look into it and examine it wholly. But they were told, that's fine, but you work together with the dedicated human who has been instructed to preach the good news of the kingdom. You have your orders, influence them, work with them. And that's exactly what had happened. Looking back into East Germany again, 2 sisters were working from door to door. This man listened and said, oh yes, come in. And when he invited them into his living room, he had a library there. And then when they had offered him the truth book, he says, I know who you are. You're Jehovah's Witnesses. In East Germany, you can go to jail for 7 years for doing that. And I'm going to tell my friend who was a policeman. And with that, he went out and locked them in. Went out to get his friend, the policeman. So the girls thought real hard, prayed about it, and very intelligently one of the sisters reached in her bag, took out the little blue book and stuck it right in the friend's library, on his bookshelf. Well, it wasn't long before the policeman came back and said, now, what is it? So he said, these 2 women, they have literature that is banned. They're Jehovah's Witnesses. So the police captain said, or the policeman, are you Jehovah's Witnesses? Yes. Well, there's nothing, that's not illegal. You have any banned literature? And the sister says, no, and held up her bag, and she saw a Bible. So he turns to the man, and very irate. He says, what are you bringing me down here for? There's nothing wrong with these women. And he said, if you expect at any time to expect me to do something, well, at least have some evidence. He says, you make a fool of me and everybody else, and you make a fool of yourself. And with that, he turned to the 2 sisters and said, now you go on. And so they went off and left the 2 shouting to each other. So they thought, well, that was a close call. But the sisters thought, you know, that blue book is very precious. Brothers risk their lives to get the literature in. And here, this old goat, he doesn't want it. So they decided to go back the next day. I don't know if I would do this right now, but they did. So they go back the next day, and they waited the distance till they saw the man leave his house and go to work. And very boldly and confidently, they went up to the home, rang the bell. And the wife answered. And very plainly they said, we were here yesterday and we left a blue book with your husband. Woman says, I don't know, I wasn't home. Yes, we know you weren't home. But we left this blue book, and he said that he thought he wasn't interested in it, and we thought we'd like to pick it up. Well, I don't see any book. I don't even know where it was. Sister said, I think it's a little blue book right in there. So the woman said, well, go ahead. So in they went, took that little precious book, put it in their bag, and then went on their way. But it reminded me of Ezekiel. You might want to turn to that, just to see what Jehovah, by means of his Spirit and with angelic direction, can do. In Ezekiel Chapter 3, here this man was so hateful, his face like flint. But now notice what chapter 3, verses 8 and 9 say. Look, I have made your face exactly as hard as their faces, and your forehead exactly as hard as their foreheads. Of course, we know Jehovah didn't make them as ugly as that man was, but just as hard, like a diamond, harder than flint, I have made your forehead. You must not be afraid of them, and you must not be struck with terror at their faces, for they are a rebellious house. So Jehovah strengthened those two sisters. They went back and got that very, very precious literature that brothers risk their lives in obtaining.
We had a wonderful experience in our congregation back in Middletown. This was a year ago in March. And two of our Bethelites were deciding whether or not they should finish a road quite a distance from the Kingdom Hall. And when you have a 12 o'clock meeting and you start at about 10 o'clock, you're almost reluctant to go all the way out a half hour's travel to work a few houses, then start back. But they decided that they better do it. So what they did was they decided to do the house. And the first house they went to, they knocked on the door and a man came out, kind of a well-built man, and they introduced themselves. And the first thing he said is, are you Jehovah's Witnesses? And they said, yes. He said, well, where you been? They were shocked. So he said, come in. So they went in, and they offered their presentation, and they placed a book with them. But there was so much interest, they kept watching the clock because they had to get back to the Kingdom Hall for their public talk. So they said, would you mind if we came back, say, at 3 o'clock this afternoon after our meeting? No, please do. So they came back to the Kingdom Hall, and they were just jittery, waiting for the talk to get over, and hurry up, finish the Watchtower study, we got to get back to this call we were going to make. So they made a return visit that same day, a few hours later. When they got back this time, instead of the man answering, was kind of a hard-faced older woman. They introduced themselves, and she wasn't smiling, but the man heard what was happening. It was his mother, and he said, it's okay, let them come in. So it was just before Memorial, and it was pretty cold. So she says, well, I'll take the children out for a walk. And there they went out in the cold weather. So they started talking to this man, and they found out that he's a former policeman from New York. Had taken an early retirement to move his family out toward the country. And he had been off from work for about 8 months because he wasn't hurting for money. And he read everything inside. He was an avid reader. So he decided to read the Bible. And every so often he'd say to his wife, honey, what does this mean? Well, did you ever read this? Listen to this. I wonder what that means. So after a while, the wife says, well, look, when I was a little girl, my mother used to study with Jehovah's Witnesses. And every time there was a question that came up, they'd always answer it from the Bible. They have the answer. Now, being a New York policeman, he had seen Jehovah's Witnesses, but he always avoided them. But now he says, aren't these the people who go from house to house? She said, yeah. Well, that's funny. We've been here 8 months, and I don't remember anybody calling. That was the night before. That was that Saturday night. Sunday, the call was made. The book was placed. The return visit was made in the afternoon, about 2.5, 3 hours later. And needless to say, a Bible study was started immediately. But then the boys found out later that being a very oriented family, there was brother, or the man and his wife and 2 children, what they would do, they'd all get in bed together, and he'd pick out what he felt was a nice TV program for the family. So he says, family, tonight, no TV. I got a special book, and we're going to discuss it. Imagine that. The book was placed at 12 o'clock. The return visit was made at 3, and the father's conducting a family study that evening at 7 o'clock. So they came back the next Sunday, that's just 7 days later, had a wonderful study, and they said, Tuesday we're going to have the memorial of Christ's death, and we'd like to invite you. He said, sure, I'll come. But then they thought, now our Kingdom Hall is at least half hour away, but because there's 3 congregations meeting in our Kingdom Hall, we have to go to a different congregation, which is another 20 minutes the opposite way. So they thought, he'll never come. He said, well, yeah, I know the area. Tell me about it. Okay, wait a minute. Draw me a map. He said, I'll be there. So Tuesday, they thought, well, I wonder if he'll be there. They had to go drive all that distance. Sure enough, here he comes with his family, his 2 children, dressed up like, if they sat in the audience, you would think they were Jehovah's Witnesses for the past 10 years. That's how well behaved and well respectful they are. They attended the memorial, hasn't missed a meeting since. In fact, they joined the Theocratic Ministry School, he and his son, and he was telling us, this was in March, so about June time, it was district assembly time. So he heard about the district assembly, so right away he says, could I come? He goes, sure you could come. So then he heard that there was one being held at Belmont Park racetrack. He said, well, my parents live close by, so instead of me going to New Haven with the congregation, could I go down to the racetrack in Belmont, and then I could be with my parents and talk to them about the Bible? Sure. So he says, well, I went down there, and then I heard the announcement about volunteer service. So he said, I went up to the volunteer man. I says, I'm a former policeman. Could I be used in security or something? The brother said, sure. So he wrote down his name. When were you baptized? He said, well, I'm not baptized. So the brother didn't want to hurt his feelings and say you can't work. So he said, well, I tell you what, being that you're not baptized, instead of filling out the form, see that elderly brother over there? Well, why don't you go on and tell him that I sent you over? He says, okay. So Lou says, I went over to the elderly brother and I explained that I'm not baptized. I let him know right off. But I am studying with Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm a former policeman, and could I be used on security? So the elderly brother was nice, and he said, sure. And he put me by some double doors where all the brothers were coming and going. But you'd have to hear him tell this, a New York Italian. He says, it was like the New World, I tell you. When I was a cop in Belmont, he says, I had my eye on all kinds of crooks and hoods around here. But they look at such nice people. He said, but you know what happened? Somebody banged into me and kept going and didn't say anything like, I'm sorry. He says, so I cased him right away. Something was up. This fellow's very observant, by the way. So he says, I noticed that he walked with a kind of a funny shuffle, and so I noticed on his right pant leg a little lump. He says, now that's why I used to carry my ankle holster, my gun, just like that. So he said, how am I going to break this to the elderly brother? So I went up to the elderly brother and I said, see those 2 men over there? And the brother looked and says, yeah. He said, I think one of them's carrying a gun. A gun? So he says, yeah. So he called another young husky brother, and when the young husky brother heard gun, he had the same reaction. So then they looked at Lou and said, would you like to come with us? So Lou, the typical policeman, says, I'll be glad to. Then he says, I fully intended to. So they went over to these 2 men, and the elderly brother says, are you gentlemen with the convention? They said, yes. Well, by this time, the elderly brother lost his poise and says, this man is a policeman. Pull up your right pants leg. So Lou says, I'm not a policeman. I was a former policeman. So the man pulls up his right trouser leg, and Lou says, you know what he had there? He says, a package of cigarettes and a cigarette lighter. And in this crowd, that's worse than a gun, isn't it? So just the type of person that he was, but very intellectual man, high in the police force, He was a policeman's policeman. He would actually investigate corruption within the police department. So when he got the truth, he really took to the truth. March the 20th was the call. Returning visit the same day. He had his family Bible study that night. The next call was the 27th. He came to Memorial on the 29th. This is of March. And on October the 29th, he was baptized. Isn't that something? It shows you the family. How do we doubt angelic direction? Why did the boys go when they had every reason not to go there that particular morning? But in answer to that prayer, Jehovah's angels were at work. Looking over toward Great Britain, there was an Iranian man in Manchester. You may remember this. When the Iranian embassy was stormed. Well, anyway, he had gone down to London, visiting the Iranian embassy, and there were 26 of them were taken hostage. And the terrorists that were in there threatened to kill one every 45 minutes, which they did. You may have seen some of this on TV and read it in the newspapers. Well, it was decided by the British police that they would storm the embassy, which they did. And when they were in with that SWAT team and bullets really flying. One bullet hit his chest and bounced off. He had some coins in a pocket up there. And he was with a young man. And he told this young 20-year-old student, he says, "Do you think there might be a message in this for us?" And well, the young man just was scared. He didn't know what to say. But he said, if we come out of this alive, he said, there must be more to life than this. We've got to find the true God and look into this. Find out what life is about. Well, they did get out alive, as you remember, from the TV report or the news report. Then about 3 weeks later, he was in Manchester visiting some friends when the brother stopped by to have the Bible study with the family there. Of course, a long discussion ensued, and this Iranian man listened to the truth, started a Bible study, was recently baptized. He then communicated with his fleshly brother who's living in Germany, and unbeknown to him, he too is studying with Jehovah's Witnesses and making excellent progress. So one thing behind the other, just seeing how, in spite of the difficulties there in a place like Iran, how Jehovah's angels can search out the deserving ones. In fact, it shows how what could be a sticky situation can turn out very nice. In Lebanon, there was a young university student started attending the meetings. Well, his mother heard about this and got very angry with him. And they lived in an apartment. And she's shouting at the boy there in the hallway. So a neighbor noticed a commotion and came out to find out what was happening. So the mother turned to the neighbor and starts irately speaking against her son, how he's going to illegal meetings and he's not listening and so on. But then the son tried to explain that the meetings weren't illegal, really. They were Bible meetings that they were going to. And he turned to the woman, who happened to be a newspaper reporter, and says, "If you don't believe me, come along and see for yourself." So the neighbor lady said, "All right, I'll go along with you." So she decided to go along, and she was absolutely amazed at the kindness and the love that was shown at the meetings. And she noticed also, in attendance at the meeting, was a brother who was paralyzed, confined to a wheelchair, and she couldn't believe how happy he was and how much he knew about the Bible. Very impressed with the truth, and she became a baptized sister. But now, as a newspaper reporter, she used to be also on TV, in that she would interview famous personalities on TV, like a Barbara Walters show. So she was given an assignment to interview the president of Iraq when he visits the embassy there in Lebanon. So she took out her little date book and she wrote it down. It was several months in advance, of course. Well, as time went by, you maybe remember this as well in the news, how the terrorists then bombed the embassy and the president of Iraq was killed there. So when she heard about that, it reminded her of her interview. Boy, I was supposed to go interview this man. And when she looks out at her little date book, that was the time and day she should have been here. But she noticed that the pages were stuck together, so she missed the appointment. Isn't that something? Because had she gone there, everyone in that room had been killed by the bomb, and she too would have been killed. You know, we always hear nice things when we get Gilead students, and we had some Gilead students that work on the farm for a while before going to school. It helps us when we are in need of assistance. And we had a young brother who was, of all things, pioneering in El Salvador. He's an American, Mike Miranda. He was pioneering there in El Salvador, and you know what's happening in El Salvador. So he was conducting a book study. And that night there's a loud bang on the door, and when they opened it, there stood 4 men with automatic rifles and sacks over their heads. They demanded to know, what are you doing here? And just imagine if you were at your book study, and this would happen to you. But one of the men said, why aren't you fighting for us? So here this young brother tried to explain about neutrality and what it meant, and being Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian. Well, these men wouldn't hear that. They didn't care. And this was very, very dicey, because just the other night there was a family group killed by men like this, not too distant from where this house was. So they knew this was very real. So as he tried to explain it, they said, well, we're not interested in that. If you're not with us, you're against us. And now that we've been here, we have no recourse but to kill you, unless you come and fight for us. Well, the brother explained that he would rather die than compromise his stand with Jehovah. He couldn't do that. But then the terrorist said, and they looked at the group around the table, what about you? They looked at a woman. So the sister looked back at him and said, no, I'd rather die than compromise. Then they looked at the next one. It was a sister. She had a young boy next to her. She began to cry, and she put her arm around her son, but they both said, no, well, we'd rather die than compromise. And they went right around the table asking each one as to what they would do. Well, when they got completely around the group, Brother Miranda thought, well, this is it. Now is when they'll make the move. But they didn't. So he thought, well, as a study conductor, what am I supposed to do? Let's all sit down and continue the study. So they sat down, and he asked the questions, and these men didn't say a word. They just watched from where they were stationed. And they went around and they had their study, and he thought, well, with my concluding comments, now this is it. So he made his concluding comments, didn't look around at the men. Nothing happened. So he said, well, how do you finish a Bible study? So we all bowed our heads and we prayed to Jehovah, and we asked for his direction. In fact, we stood up to pray. He says, you know, when we opened our eyes, the soldiers were gone. What a test, eh? Just imagine yourself with your children in a place like El Salvador, where life is so cheap. But again, we see with Jehovah, his spirit, his direction, and as Matthew 18 says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in your midst. And let's look back to that very faithful man, Daniel. Daniel chapter 3. And there's a very famous account about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, in verse 28 says, after observing that there was not a hair singed on the head of those 3 brothers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar was answering and saying, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants that trusted in him, and that changed the very word of the king and gave over their bodies, because they would not serve and would not worship any God at all except their own God. Isn't that something? Having the king acknowledge the fact that here these men, these young boys, would not compromise their stand. And over in chapter 6, looking at verse 22, here it says, My own God sent his angel and shut the mouth of lions, and they have not brought me to ruin, for as much as before him innocence itself was found in me, and also before you, O king, no hurtful act have I done. So here the angel again now was used by Jehovah to shut the mouths of lions. Well, we're certainly impressed with that, aren't we? In Watchtower Farms, we have a sister who married one of the farm boys. Her family is in Ethiopia, and they're one of the first families that have been in Ethiopia, and they've been imprisoned. And to give you a little idea of what prison is like in Africa, it's not like here where you can get a college education at government expense. In Africa, if you go to prison because you've broken the law, they don't feed you. Why should they? Why should they spend money for your upkeep? So it's up to your family or some philanthropic organization to feed you. Well, these young girls, and one of them is named Ruth, who's now 16 years old, has been in prison for about 7 years. Her sister Esther is at the farm, and so she received this letter from her sister. And keep in mind that the sisters were in different prisons at the time, and only mother was free to bring food to the various prisons. And here's what she writes. My dear sister, from the day and hour we were separated, I have wondered how you are. Thanks to Jehovah, we are fine. My dearest sister, we are thirsting for you like water, and hungering for you like food. Do not be surprised or wonder why we are scattered like this. Is in prison, you are not far away, and some at home, and let us be happy because Jehovah has a purpose for everything. And if it is his will, we are happy. When Jehovah wills, we will see each other again, even though some of our relatives and friends took the number of the beast on their heads. Isn't it interesting how we can understand that? Some of their relatives and friends have taken the number of the beast on their heads. For ourselves, we will work hard and in being faithful and strong. Please help us in your prayers. Our faithfulness will make the gold refined by fire and the wheat separated from the weeds. Without getting weak or tired, we will be fine examples maybe to our brothers and sisters. Have you heard? And remember, this is a 16-year-old. We were taken to another prison. You should see it. It's fantastic. A prison, fantastic. We can make tea. Take a shower every week. And it's about 30 minutes walk from home. This way, Mom won't have a hard time with transportation to bring us our food. You know, she has to go to 3 different prisons now. I think she is the one more persecuted than we are. So, sister, how is service? You should like it, for you are blessed with a lot of it there. Hold on there, and do it all for us. Take advantage of it. Daniel was allowed to go out of prison to buy some plumbing supplies, and he's able to bring us back some spiritual food. He was able to smuggle in a Bible. I get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and read it so no one sees me. Isn't that how our Bible reading is doing? So I asked her, I heard how you called home and cried. I know how you feel. But please don't worry and cry, because you should be happy. Because Jehovah is fulfilling his purpose through us, and there is nothing better. Please write, because they are allowing us to read some. Your sister Ruth. P.S. If you want to see us in the new system, please remain faithful, because I hear Satan works harder over there. Imagine. But we've got a report, just of recent origin, that the girls are now out of prison. When we think of the faithful and discreet slave, how Jehovah is using them together with the angels, when you think of how Jehovah warns us and how they try to put us on alert, as it were, they try to help us to see what's happening in the world. Look at our calendar. Have you noticed it? Did you look at our calendar carefully? Did you notice there was one picture of Lebanon? Well, we had a circuit overseer from Lebanon visiting us at the farm. And he was explaining how the brothers there in Lebanon, when they see the shelling over there, they witness over here. But they know the pattern of the shelling. So the next day, they know that the shelling might come a little closer this way and will work itself this way. So they go and witnessing over there, where they had already shelled part of the city. And did you notice on the various displays on the calendar, each one was in a country where the work is under ban. Look at it carefully when you go home. Because these are not things that we're going to say, well, that was wonderful for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or as marvelous how Moses could face Pharaoh. What we're looking at is what's happening to Jehovah's Witnesses at this very moment because of their stand for Jehovah and for his King Christ Jesus. So look at that carefully. And also your yearbook. I thought it was so good about theocratic strategy in Belgium, where during World War II, if you remember, the brother had some watchtowers, the manuscripts for watchtowers that were to be run off in his bag, and he thought he'd take a back road at night. And as he did, two of the Gestapo got hold of him. So when they got hold of him, they said, put your hands up. So he took his bag and he put it between his knees, and he put his hands up. So they frisked him up there. And then they said, we're going to frisk you down below. He said, okay. And he put it up like that. Good thinking, eh? So when you read that, you enjoy it, but it just shows that, again, the need of being close to Jehovah and close to his organization, and how important it is to be able to do these things in a proper way. Now, a little more on the light side, you may have heard of this. This was this past summer, or 2 summers ago, really. This was one that a letter was sent, and I thought you'd enjoy it. You may have heard it, but if you have, listen anyway. Well, you don't have a choice. But as you listen carefully, though, listen to angelic intervention. This past summer, while on a business trip to Washington, D.C. area, Jehovah really blessed my efforts. I met with several medical doctors in a conference which led up to 3 hours of witnessing and a placement of several blood booklets and 6 subscriptions. On my return trip to Missouri by way of St. Louis, I thought of how Jehovah had blessed my activities. My plane landed in St. Louis, and after a 2-hour layover, I was called to the ticket counter and told that I had been bumped for an emergency passenger. My layover then turned out to be 9 hours of sitting and carrying a large electric microscope. And every time I passed through the security area, I had to stop, open up the case, unpack the microscope, and the guard would look and say, oh, it's a microscope. I'd say, yes, put it all, repack it all, and get more irritated. At last, I boarded the plane for home, Springfield, Missouri. On all flights that are not booked full, it's usually that the middle seat is left unoccupied to allow for more room and more comfort for the seated passengers. After being seated in the aisle with a gentleman next to the window, I settled back for a comfortable flight home. Since the plane at this time was less than half full, I was quite surprised to have someone say, excuse me, and take the middle seat, with all these empty seats on the plane. Well, after a few minutes, we started to converse. It turned out this man happened to be an Army colonel in charge of the aircraft maintenance of over 15 states. Our conversation led to problems with his wife. He told me that after 20 years of marriage, his wife was on drugs and had tried to commit suicide 4 times, and now was about to leave him for a younger man. He was a total stranger pouring out his heart to me. Doesn't that happen to Jehovah's Witnesses? They wouldn't tell things to a marriage counselor, they wouldn't tell their mother, but they tell us. Well, I closed my eyes for a time, and I prayed to Jehovah to help me with the right words. I started to witness to him, telling him about God's kingdom and how there'd be no more sickness, no more sorrow, no tears, no need for military aircraft, just happiness. I told him about the fine scriptural help given from the Awake and Watchtower magazines. Well, he asked how he could get these magazines for himself and also to have some sent to his wife. I told him all I needed was the address where he was located in California. He gave me his card. I then asked for the address of his wife, but he couldn't find a pen, and he asked me for one. But before I could get mine out, the man sitting next to the window had one in the colonel's hand. I hadn't realized it, but he had been listening all the time. I told the colonel I could have one of Jehovah's Witnesses call on his wife in California if he would like. He said he would try anything. The plane landed, and when I got up to get off, the couple seated in front of us turned around and had tears in their eyes, as did 2 Bible students from a local school seated across the aisle. The man sitting next to the window said he'd like to have the same magazines, so I took his name and address. The lady in front of me said she wanted the magazines also. The 2 students across the aisle said that they wanted the magazines and some books. And the person behind me says, "Don't leave me out, I want some too." So I took all their names and addresses, and on this trip, the final total was 22 subscriptions, 21 books, and 45 magazines. I wonder who bumped him off that first plane. How come he squeezed in that seat there with all those other seats available? Well, that angel flying in mid-heaven, he's going to be heard. Whether we like it or not, he's going to be heard. So the gentleman, or the brother rather, continues, I wrote the society and asked for someone from the local congregation in his town, California, to call on the colonel's wife. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from one of the brothers that he and his wife and another sister had called on the colonel's wife, spent a couple of hours, placed a book, and had plans for a possible Bible study. A few weeks later, I called the colonel, and he informed me that he and his wife were back together again. So, kind of a happy ending. But hopefully it's not an ending, but a happy kind of time of being able to come around. When we look at those angels, we want to recognize a few things. We want to recognize that they are as zealous in carrying out their assignments as we are. They feel an obligation toward us. They just can't let us flounder. They can't leave us alone in the midst of stepped-up demonic activity. Satan is not only a roaring lion, but a wounded lion. And you know, in Africa, the wounded lion is the one that you've got to watch. For this reason, a wounded lion can't hunt for his own food and get other animals. A wounded lion preys for humans because we're the easiest prey. They can get us a lot easier than they can get a gazelle or a zebra. So Satan is like a wounded lion. And keeping that in mind, he'd do everything and the most debased things you can think of. And look at how debased the world is getting. Look at child abuse and all the things we read in the Wake. That brings us right up to date so that we're not behind in what's happening. We know what's happening. We are knowledgeable. The faithful and discreet slave is making sure of that. So we think of it. The angels are likewise stepping up their activity because Jehovah says they should. When we look back, we see how from the Bible they freed apostles from prison. They instructed them to continue to preach. They brought Philip, the Ethiopian, together. They helped Cornelius and Peter. Paul was counseled and helped by the angels. Jesus sent an angel with a revelation to John. In fact, the word angel, having to do with Revelation now, is found more often in the book of Revelation than in any other Bible book. And no doubt their activity in this time of the end is more important now to humans than at any other time in human history. Their activity is that important. So in these last days, we can see what assignments the angels have. They're responsible reapers for the harvest. You know, we don't do the reaping. We do the preaching, the teaching. It's the angels that do the protecting and directing, but will also be having a hand in doing the reaping come Armageddon. And another thing that the angels are responsible for is to gather out all the offensive things from Jehovah's organization. Get rid of it. Now, we started our discourse by talking about that woman who was so distraught there in the Netherlands and called that pioneer sister. Listen to this recent letter sent to Brother Jack Barb, the governing body, or sent to the society. Dear brothers, I would only like to share with you my experience of angelic direction to Jehovah. This was my second marriage of only 1 year and 6 months, and I was pregnant. I had a 3.5-year-old son from a former previous marriage, and from the start, my present marriage was on the rocks. My husband and son could not get along. My husband was hateful and cruel to my son. My son would have bruises all over his neck and his arms. My son and I were always walking around as if walking on eggs, not knowing what to do and scared to make a move. My husband wanted me to have an abortion. I had no family in this state, so I had no one to turn to. From knowing Jehovah when I was a little girl, I knew who God was, but fell away from the truth at 13 years of age because of a divorce in my home with my own parents. I was scared. I just wanted to die when one night my husband beat my son so bad that I could stand it no more. I prayed and prayed to die and called several people. Imagine calling several people on the phone before I found someone who would take over the legal guardianship of my son. So I was going to end it all. So there she really meant business, didn't she? I stayed up all night crying and planning my suicide and smoking cigarettes. I finally prayed out loud, Jehovah, Jehovah, please help me. I then would step outside and look over the balcony of the apartments and up and down the road and say quietly aloud, oh, I wonder if Jehovah's Witnesses call on these apartments. I need someone to talk to. In sheer exhaustion, I crawled up in a chair and fell asleep. That morning, there was a knock on my door. I opened the door, and 2 women were standing there. And they asked for a girl who never lived here before. I told them there was no one here by that name. I then noticed the book bag that one lady was carrying, and I asked her, are you who I think you are? And the one woman replied, who might that be? And I answered in an unsure way, Jehovah's Witnesses? Then she said yes. I nearly cried and asked them right in and started a study with me the following week. In the course of that study, I learned that this woman had called on this other girl many times before, but for some reason, she was directed clear across town to where I live. That woman never lived in this apartment. And although the sister had called over there time and again, here she's calling on this apartment and asking for the girl and wondering why she's there. She says, she finishes her letter, I am now happily serving Jehovah and getting baptized this February the 4th, 1984. Your soon-to-be sister, and she signs her name. So is our work important? Is our work life-saving? There's no doubt about it. And our work, although important and life-saving, we know that it's not in our own strength we do it, but in Jehovah's strength, working together with his organization and working in conjunction with the angels. A thought that I would like to leave with you is one that the Watchtower pointed out nicely. I noticed our singing from the new songbook. Well, it says, mass singing of kingdom songs shows a united heart. So we should really sing with gusto like those Levites on the end sheet of our songbook. Look at their faces. Like a vein sticks out on their necks, and you can see their tonsils just about. They're singing with such joy. Well, now, the reason we can do like that is because Jehovah's angels are standing guard and furnishing invisible protection. Turn with me to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 1, the 14th verse. And here we read, speaking of angels, are they not all spirits for public service, sent forth to minister for those who are going to inherit salvation? So when you think of it, here we are singing kingdom songs together, showing a united heart, and the angels being around us as public servants. Otherwise, we would be targets, wouldn't we? Wow, wouldn't it be something for the demons to come right now and destroy every one of us? Be nothing for them to do if it weren't for the fact that Jehovah's angels will be here. So here we are in assembly. We stand up, we sing from the heart, we sing together, and we get the feeling of security and peace and joy and happiness. And the reason for that is we are assured that the services rendered by the angels are certainly being carried out. So we think of it as dedicated people. What a joy to be dedicated announcers. Yes, preachers and teachers of the good news of the established kingdom. And what a comfort it is for all of us to know that Jehovah has assigned angels a definite part in protecting and directing the preaching work.